It's a favorite subject of mine, going 700 years back in time. Let's discuss sword and buckler. Hello everyone, Lauren here in the spare room today, and we are going to talk about possibly my favorite martial arts system, sword and buckler. That's right, there's a martial arts system for using a sword and a small shield called a buckler. And we're going to go into the history of that today, give you some brief overview of how this works. It's a fairly short video, I hope, but it's going to really broaden your horizons into what martial arts can be. So especially for the beginner, if you don't have any knowledge of European martial arts, this is a very important introduction for you, because the oldest martial arts manual that exists in the world is this right here. Okay, obviously not this actual book. This is a reproduction from the Royal Armouries of 133, the manuscript, also known as Tower Fight Book, Walpurgis Fecht Book, and Ludiger Fecht Book. Fecht Book means fight book in German. It is a martial arts manual, and it is from the early 14th century. Leading theory right now, probably between 1320 and 1330, so 700 years old. The original is 700 years old. That's a pretty ancient edition. Comes from Germany, Holy Roman Empire. Probably from a cathedral school, not a monastery. The characters inside are a priest and a student. They're not dressed like monks. And the best part about this manual is way at the back. My post-it note fell out, so it takes a while to find. There we go. There's a woman. Walpurgis is her name, and that's what leads to this being referred to as the Walpurgis Fight Book quite often, and that's how I refer to it most of the time, or 133, the catalogue number in the Royal Armouries. But there she is, and she is fighting with a sword and a buckler. She doesn't have head covering, she's not dressed like a nun, she's obviously a secular person. So if we go back in time 700 years, we have people fighting with sword and buckler. They're fencing, and it's both a practice system for people to do, plus, in my opinion, a self-defense system for travelers. And it does get used on the battlefield. We know that archers are going to have sword and buckler a lot of the time as their backup. And you're using your bow, you run out of arrows, or the enemy gets too close, you need to refer back to something more to your sidearms, sword and buckler. Very common. But this manual here gives us great insight into how to use a sword and buckler. It tells us all about this little round shield. Not always round, but in the period we're talking about, it's a small round shield with a metal boss, dome. This one is also made of wood and canvas and leather. Center grip, because it has to be maneuverable. If it's strapped to your arm, it's good for defense, but this is a different system. And as a martial arts system, when we bring the arming sword back into it, it is creating a zone of defense in front of you. This is called Halbschild or half shield, one of the German terms used in a mostly Latin manuscript. And we put the sword and buckler out in front of us, and we create this zone. We're forcing the opponent to deal with the sword. They can't just come in and attack, because I have options. And the buckler has to be maneuverable, and that's why it's center held. It's also with this center handle, you put it on a hook on your belt. The name buckler most likely comes from the French word boucler, which means shield. It's still used today as the word shield. We know that England and France have this connection, and a lot of French words move into use in England after the Norman conquest of 1066. Boucler, probably referring more to the shield boss at this point, could be one of those words. So, buckler. Now, we do have this feature on shields going back to antiquity. Celts, Romans, they all have a center gripped shield with a boss, which helps protect the hand. It also gives a little bit more room for your hand to operate, so you don't have to have such a large handle. There are larger, rounder wooden handles on some bucklers, Some of them have more metal work. Some of them are leather with metal. This one is wood. Made it myself. Very proud of this. It's in my martial arts club colors. That's our logo, which you also see in the intro and outro panels of the video. You'll see our little heater shield logo. But we know that the buckler, in this context, 14th century, isn't the primary shield for the battlefield. That's a heater shield. Triangular shield, strapped to the arm, could be held just by the straps in your fist. But this is more about self-defense. That's my theory. And part of that comes from reading the Canterbury Tales. So we have reference. Oh, camera's out of focus. Focus! There we go. We'll leave that in. We'll just do one take when we tell you all this great stuff. The Canterbury Tales mentions sword and buckler several times. Now, when we are talking about the characters, we have the yeoman. He's going on the pilgrimage. He's the servant of the knight. And by his side, a sword and a rough buckler. We have the miller going on the pilgrimage. And he bore a sword and buckler by his side. And then in the Reeve's Tale, we have two students who are going to travel. They're going to travel to see a miller, because the Reeve's Tale is to show why millers are dastardly. And the two students who are going to travel, it says this: when Alan had collected all his gear, upon a horse he slung a sack of corn. And so the pair set off, Alan and John, each with stout sword and buckler by his side. So obviously, in literature in the late 14th century, we have mention of sword and buckler. And fight manuals continue to use sword and buckler well into 15th, 16th, 17th century. We get reference to bucklers used with swords. This one is Talhofer, 1467, sword and buckler featured inside. Eventually, buckler shapes change. They're not always going to stay round. They could become diamond or lozenge shaped. They could be a square. There's a wavy square design. They're being used with rapiers. They're being used with side swords or cut and thrust swords in the 16th century. So they have their purpose. Now, when you have a buckler, we're going to be in what we call the second guard or second ward, the dextrali, in sword and buckler. And if the buckler is out in front, you're creating a zone of defense. You're creating this triangle that your opponent has to get around. That's very useful. There I go. I'm putting this out in front. I'm looking over the top of it. I've got my sword ready to cut. And I bring my buckler in to protect my hand. That is a basic move of sword and buckler. So I'm defending, and then I can thrust. The buckler is moving around all the time. If I move the sword to a different position, the buckler is going to move as well. And that's our 14th century 133 style. The buckler always stays close to the hand. We're going to see that change in later manuals where the buckler isn't always close to the hand, where it's more defensive. But one thing is consistent in that the buckler is used to strike away an opposing sword and shield. And that's one thing that we see a lot in our 133 is the shield strike. Something very important. So if you were designing a video game or role-playing game, shield strike should be something that you have in there. Because I bind with the opposing sword, I knock the opposing sword out of the way. I now create an opening for a thrust or a cut. Or a thrust strike, as we have in 133, which is you thrust in, but you hit the side and slice along, rather than just jabbing the point into something. A very cool move. Especially good when you can land it on someone's fencing mask and give them pause in the middle of sparring. You can also punch with the buckler. You could hit with the boss, but I prefer the side, getting all that energy from your strike into the smallest possible point of contact. Buckler punch is one of my favorite things to do in sword and buckler sparring. You get bound, you step aside to get out of the way of the incoming blow, and you come around and you strike the person. Of course, everyone in my club knows I do that, so if I'm sparring sword and buckler, which there's not a lot of in 2020, but they know they're going to buckler punch me at the same time. So a lot of it, with more advanced people, we're just buckler punching each other a lot. But it's a lot of fun. So it's a system that we know is for fun fencing. it is where fencing kind of starts, as far as we know, because it is the oldest manual, the oldest reference we have. There are countless, I shouldn't say countless, there are references to students fencing when they should be studying, and how fencing and fight school are banned. We have German references, we have English references for that. We know that swords aren't allowed to be carried in towns. It's for traveling outside, because people get into matches and hurt each other, even if they don't intend to, or they use it as self-defense, because they have their sword and buckler, and they start fighting. Bucklers, particularly in England and Scotland, do get used quite late. Still very popular in Elizabethan times. Almost tripped over that word. But yeah, those are just some basics of sword and buckler. Just a few little information to show you that there's this big wide world of martial arts out there. And this is one of the items. There is a full weapon fighting system recorded 700 years ago that tells us all about how people could defend themselves or just involve themselves in a sport, sparring with another person. Arming sword and buckler. My favorite martial arts system. I love it. It's so much fun. I hope that you've enjoyed the video. Thank you very much for watching. Please remember, like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and I'll see you next time for more talk about swords.